All right, everyone, welcome back. This is part 2 of episode 3. This is we're kind of just talking about bodybuilding training in this episode. Right now, we're going to kind of get into more things, get a little bit further into the weeds, as Greg Knuckles would say. But we're going to kind of talk about some things that Shay and I aren't 100% sure on, but more like food for thought for kind of the viewers to kind of think about and just kind of our thoughts on the questions.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Let's get into it.
Yeah, so the one thing that I have been kind of confused about lately is like in part 1 of the episode we talked about intensity and like proximity to failure. Obviously, training to a 0 IR is gonna have more stimulus than a 2 IR. You know, just because it's a harder set. So like we know that, but in terms of fatigue, like is training to 0 IR really that much more fatiguing, where it's gonna limit you session to session? So like that's kind of like if a 0 IR is more stimulating, like in the back of my head, I'm thinking like, wouldn't I want to train to that more often, you know, than just maybe one like during Hell Week or whatever? So like, could I do that, or is the fatigue that limiting? Like, does the fatigue skyrocket after that 2 RAR or 1 RAR, where like you can't recover session to session?
The way I see it is, I don't think so. I think that the difference between 2 or even 3 RAR and 0 isn't huge. And like the fatigue that you can get from that isn't like astronomically different, right? Because like 3 RAR is still really close to failure. 2 RAR still is too.
Right.
And I think they both come along with a lot of fatigue, and I feel like that's where like adding sets comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because like the amount of like extra fatigue that you can add that might limit you session to session
might come from volume or so.
Yeah, it might come from volume. Yeah, like if you do an extra 2 reps, do you really think that's gonna make your?
That's kind of where I'm sitting. It's like,
yeah.
That's why I always have a hard time holding myself back, because it's like, I know I have 2 more, and it's like, well, fuck, why not do 2 more if I can? Mm-hmm. And obviously, like, I'll have a couple feeder sets or whatever before I do, like, my actual working sets. Mm-hmm. So it's not like every set I'm doing is to failure, but, like, if I know, like, if I'm doing bent over rows, and I have, let's say, like, 4 total sets, and 2 of those sets are, like, actual hard working sets, like, my mind says, like, I'm taking those 2 working sets to, like, technical failure. Mm-hmm. But, like, some people will say, like, oh, you got to progress those week to week. And, like, which I do to a certain extent. But, like, it's just so hard sometimes when it's, like, am I really going to, like, overshoot from doing an extra rep? Mm-hmm. You know? So that's kind of, like... And I know, like, Dr. Mike always says, like, we were kind of talking before the episode, like, he literally said in his podcast with Lane Norton that, like, beyond that 2 IR, the fatigue is so... Like, he said, like, the fatigue skyrockets after that. Where, like, the ability to recover kind of becomes a limiting factor with progression. And I get that. And I see where he's coming from, because I think the counter argument to what we're kind of getting at here is that, like, in the long run, that little, like, the 0 RAR might only be, like, 2% more fatiguing. But in the long run, that 2% will accumulate over time, where it's like you might get more progress in the long run, not training to failure every single set than if you were to. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Something I just also wanted to touch on. Hold on, I totally lost my train of thought. Fuck.
No worries. We can play some elevator music.
Yeah, elevator music. I was thinking that too.
I probably just made it worse. My bad.
I think kind of what I wanted to touch on was that, like, I feel like a lot of times when people think about 0 RAR, they think about technical or absolute failure. Mm-hmm. So, like, just using your entire body in order to get another rep or something. Like, I think
doing absolute failure would be stupid, because that's where it becomes really fatiguing, in my opinion. But on the terms of, like, when you put absolute failure next to technical failure, like, okay, so, like, there's 3 RAR, there's 2 RAR, there's 1 RAR, and then there's 0 RAR, which is technical failure in our terms. Yep. And then absolute failure would be like -3 RAR, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Which I think that's
like,
where...
You shouldn't do those fucking 3 reps.
Yeah, man. I think that's where the real fatigue comes from, is when you go to that absolute failure, that -3 RAR, where it's like, you're just doing junk shit at that point.
Yeah. Also, like, I feel like this is kind of where Mike comes into play with what he was talking about, is that if you're doing all of your sets, for example, on like a little bit closer to failure. So let's say you're doing all your sets one day at 2 RER, and then let's compare that to another day where you're doing the same amount of sets at 0 RER. If you're doing all those sets all to technical failure, you'll probably accumulate more fatigue from that, like not necessarily astronomically more, but a sizable amount more, right? Like if you're doing multiple sets, like really close to like at technical failure, then the fatigue you get isn't like linearly related. But if you are always going to that in your session, like you also have to take into account like how much volume you're doing with that.
I think we're kind of answering our question here.
Yeah,
because it's kind of all wrapping back to like in part 1 too, like knowing your MRV. Because I think that allows you to know like, can I push myself to that failure point, or
right.
when should I?
Yeah,
you know.
So it's definitely not to say that Mike is fucking stupid for thinking that. Like,
no, because
like
I'm sure if he got on here, he would totally have some way to destroy us. That's what we're saying. But.
Yeah, and be able to provide a more like I don't know, like more definitive answer. But like kind of what we're doing is just kind of exploring the topic and trying to think through it.
Yeah,
and just kind of, you know, it's kind of fun to think through topics like that.
I definitely and with how I'm training right now, I'm definitely following a progressive scheme in terms of RIR, where like I am working on holding myself back, and it's hard, but like part of me wants, like, I want to be told that you can turn to failure every time, like, because that's just kind of how I train.
Yeah,
and,
I understand.
And again, I'm not saying like every set I do is to failure, but typically, I'll have a set or two for an exercise that's not, I wouldn't say a technical failure that's 0 IR, but maybe more so like a 1 or a 2, you know, a 1 or a 2. So it's just like, I feel like you can get more out of that. And I don't think the fatigue accumulated from that is enough to really like put you over the edge.
But again, it depends on the exercise, right?
That is true, yeah.
That's a huge part of it because, yeah, if you go to 0 RR on a back squat or a deadlift, and
you're probably going to die.
Yeah, chances of your technique being spot on for that is probably pretty low. But like if you're doing bicep curls or you're doing some shoulders or you're doing a small muscle group like that, rear delts, like I think you can definitely go more like to technical failure with those than not.
Because the fatigue accumulated from a bicep curl is way less than the fatigue accumulated from even a 4 RIR squat.
For sure.
So like, yeah, it definitely depends on the exercise.
Like there's definitely a lot of moving parts to it, and saying that like
pretty much single joint exercises, you probably can take to failure.
Yeah.
And recover from it.
Like literally even all the time if you wanted to.
Yeah, and I feel like that's honestly fine. I kind of do.
Yeah, I've been doing something very similar too.
And I just kind of been progressing with volume with my smaller muscle groups because they can handle more. We kind of back to what you were saying with exercises.
Like just like applying RIR and going to 3 or 4 RIR to start with like every single exercise. I feel like you can't really treat it like a blanket statement like that. It's got to be more so like
exercise dependent.
Exercise dependent, right?
Yeah.
Like if an exercise is like a huge compound movement that provides a lot of fatigue for you, multiple joints involved, a lot of load involved.
Yeah.
Then going to technical failure on that would probably destroy you and affect the rest of your sessions going forward.
It'd probably affect the rest of your mesocycle for a while too,
right?
Because it's just like, again, kind of answering our own question, like maybe that's why we don't. And I think it is exercise dependent. So I think that would be the answer to, is 0 IR really more fatiguing than 2? I think depending on the exercise, if it's a single joint exercise, in my opinion, no.
Barely.
But maybe on a bigger compound, I think, yeah. Because I think doing a 0 RIR squat probably isn't going to set you up for much progression in the long run.
Right. And something we also wanted to touch on very related to that topic is how volume versus intensity affects fatigue. So the way I'd like to think about it is kind of like if you add volume, you're adding more physical work to your programming. which means you have to get, somewhat hyped up for the next set. You have to get in the zone. You have to, get your technique figured out for another set, like a whole nother bout of
Those are your
lifting.
sweaty extras. Those are your sweaty workouts usually. You just fucking
Right.
going. And,
Yeah, tons of volume. There's no question that if you do more volume, you're going to be spending more time in the gym. You're going to be spending more time exerting yourself. And I'd say, there's no question that, in my opinion, that more volume equals more fatigue.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas with intensity, if you want to take that side of it.
Yeah, so that's actually really good because that's kind of like back to what I was saying, I think in part one, how my volume is more so static.
Mhm.
And because I have a static volume, I feel like it allows me to extend the length of my mesocycles longer. Because I don't have that huge ramp up in volume where it's like, fuck, I can't recover anymore.
So kind of what the question was volume versus intensity for fatigue management. And, I already kind of just covered that, doing more volume is going to lead to more fatigue. And there's really no question about that.
Yep. Like you say, you do like over time, you're just doing more and more work.
Mm-hmm.
More sets, more reps, more time
moving your body more, with load.
Yeah, but I think what we were trying to get to with the intensity side of things is maybe like a higher intensity week to week. Also can drive up fatigue just because systemically, like you're seeing this, like if you're doing heavy squats every single week, like to be able to do that weeks on end that's just hard because like putting yourself under that much load is super fatiguing on the central nervous system and whatnot. So I think in that sense, I think intensity and volume both will drive up fatigue over the long run. Personally, I found with myself that if you're focusing on progressing with lower volume and higher intensity, so like focusing more on increase in load week to week and within an appropriate rep range for hypertrophy, I think you can. For me personally, I find that I can extend my mesocycles because the fatigue doesn't accumulate as fast as if I were to focus more on ramping up the volume and sets per week.
Yeah, I think that totally makes sense. Kind of the way that I see it is very, very similar to that. Just that, now that I'm more experienced with technique and I have better set quality, like I was explaining earlier, maybe that was in the first part, was that, I'll just progress volume slower than I did in the past and still be able to progress my mesocycles probably even longer than 4 weeks.
Yeah, definitely. I think 4 weeks, I think you could do for more than 4 weeks for sure.
Yeah.
If you're progressing, why not,
Yeah.
That's what I look at it.
Yeah, and if I feel like volume can be added nice and slow, just kind of depending more on your pump, soreness, disruption, kind of what I was getting at earlier.
Yeah.
But it's kind of smarter to do that instead of just adding volume, ignoring all the other variables.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you want to talk about the second question or second part?
Yeah. So the next thing we kind of wanted to talk about was this question that I think we both kind of have quite a bit, which is something that we probably don't have a super good answer to, although we kind of answered our first question just by kind of just dissecting it a little bit.
Yeah.
But the question is kind of the benefits of having lower SFR movements in your programming. So movements that are very stimulating, but also have a lot of fatigue that comes along with them.
Your barbell squats, your bent over rows.
Your deadlifts, maybe.
Yeah, deadlifts for sure.
Versus having exercises that are externally stabilized that might have better SFRs or probably do have better SFRs.
And lower fatigue.
Yeah. And I feel like this is kind of a question that we both kind of thought about more after kind of listening a bit more to the Camp Jansen crowd.
Yeah.
And because they're big on including big compounds. in their in their programming, and aren't quite as big on always just doing externally stabilized movements like a hack squat.
I think the gist of this question is basically we're not saying you don't need a squat or whatever, but if the goal is hypertrophy, are you fine with just doing a hack squat if it's super stimulating and doesn't accumulate as much fatigue as a barbell squat?
Mm-hmm.
A barbell squat, if you have it figured out, can be great for your quads, but I think it's safe to bet that it's way more fatiguing than a hack squat over time. So can you get more out of that hack squat in terms of hypertrophy in your legs or whatever versus a squat? Why do people think that why some people are just so set on squat, and I'm not saying squat is a great movement, Like nothing against it, but like if you can get that same stimulus at less cost, like why not? Like, that's how I see it personally.
And the nice thing about the nice thing about externally stabilized movements is that you don't have quite as much to think about.
Yeah.
And like think about exactly where all your joint positions are, just so you don't like screw yourself over, because it's way easier with those like big compound movements to have like a slightly wrong move that leads to an injury, especially if your injury proclivity is high. Personally, mine kind of is, but like I feel like it comes into the sort of similar to volume, where like experience is definitely important. Like if you are super experienced with a movement like the squat and you're able to move it like in a really, really good way for your anatomy and be able to provide a good stimulus with that, then like it's probably a really good movement.
Right.
As long as you're smart about progressing it. But
I also think though too, as a beginner, that you should maybe include those.
Agree. Yeah.
You know? Like I think if you're a beginner and new, I don't think that jumping in a hack squat is gonna benefit you right away. Like it will benefit you because you don't have to worry about anything, but like you kind of need a reason to jump into the hack squat before jumping into it. Like if you can't even squat in the first place,
then
that's I think that's
going into a squatting pattern wouldn't really.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like their argument is that like squats and like barbell squats and like deadlifts and shit are so like they do require so much like technique and like stabilization like internally and whatnot that like I think they're looking at it as a more of a foundation.
Yeah.
You know, like if you don't have that foundation, like why would you be doing something else?
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Although like I totally agree that beginners should be doing big compound lifts like that.
Right.
One, because it's less work for more muscles.
Yeah.
But like what I was trying to touch on with like more advanced individuals that have a lot to think about with it.
Exactly.
That's where like more load comes into play.
Right.
You know?
And if the ultimate goal is hypertrophy and you can get the same amount with less fatigue, it's like why wouldn't you do that? And I think that's kind of what you're getting at, right?
Yeah. Right. Like kind of what I'm getting at is like when you're going up to like really high loads, like really strong people do that are very experienced. They just have a lot more to like think about with those movements.
Like squats, you're saying?
Like squats.
Yeah.
Squats,
I think Charlie had a post on this the other day.
Yeah.
He was talking about how he's gonna take squats out because the load's getting so heavy that like the payoff isn't worth it.
Right. And yeah, he would need to like focus in so much on everything that's going on with his body that like it would be more so like a mental battle than like actually taxing the muscles that he's trying to tax, right?
Right.
He's like an 800-pound squatter or some shit.
Yeah, it's insane. So it's like to keep ramping the load up on that, it's like, how do you?
Right.
Like that.
And safely.
And exactly, and safely. It's just that's why I think like externally stuff comes in more or starts becoming more beneficial for like hypertrophy in the sense because you don't have to fucking put 900 pounds on the bar instead of 800.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and just the stimulus to fatigue ratio or stimulus to injury chance ratio too.
Right.
It's definitely important as people progress and the more they get into training. So like there's definitely benefits to having like those compounds in your training, even if they come with a ton of fatigue, especially as a beginner.
Because the trade-off might be worth it at that point.
Right. The trade-off will be worth it. You're using a relatively light load compared to what you would be using if you're super neurologically adapted. You've been doing the movement for years.
Right.
Like at that point, you're going to be pretty strong, and you might accumulate some sort of injury proclivity issues,
or just overall fatigue from it in general. Right. It isn't worth it.
Yep. Right. So, like, definitely right away, I think we could both recommend that doing those big movements is a really, really good idea.
Right.
But like eventually once you determine how your body moves, like what different exercises feel like and how they are on a stimulus to fatigue ratio basis.
That kind of can determine like maybe cycling other things that might benefit you more.
Cycling other things.
Cycling other things. We are not cycling other things yet.
We are not cycling other things yet.
I don't know why I said yet. I don't even know if that's
But yeah, I think that's kind of what we wanted to touch on. Like, I know that there would be a lot of other people in the industry that would be able to provide a much more definitive answer to this question and also the question earlier on.
It's definitely some good food for thought, though.
Good, yeah, right.
Because it's like, I don't know, it's just one of those things that it's like, like, some people are saying you have to squat, and then there's guys that are saying, well, why do you have to squat if you can do this and get the same results? And I think there's just two sides to it, and I don't think either side is wrong. I think both sides have real good points. It's just like, I don't know.
It's like, where do you want to go with your training?
Yeah, I guess where do you want to go with your training? I think, although having that fundamental, like, those fundamentals down is important, though.
Agreed.
Like,
because then that makes sure you're...
Like, if you want to be an IFBB pro and you can't even fucking squat normally, it's like...
Funny thing is a lot of them can't.
A lot of them can't, yeah. That is a very good point. That's a very good point. But, like, okay, let's look at it this way. But I'm sure all of them have got under a squat bar and grown their legs from squatting.
Yeah,
some sort. Like, that's what I'm kind of trying to say. Is like,
yeah, no, I know what you're saying.
But that's a very good point, yeah. Or can't even row to save their lives.
Yeah, they're like half squatting or whatever. But
they're doing their shrugs or their rows.
Yeah, right. Well, or maybe that could also, like something that I've kind of thought about as far as, like, Instagram bodybuilding goes, is maybe sometimes those guys are, like, lifting those crazy amounts of weights just to get some attention on there, and usually they don't do that.
Yeah. Or they're more
Could
going to, yeah. Do you mean, like, attention on Instagram or, like...
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely.
Just for, like the masses to be like, holy shit, like, this makes sense, this guy's huge, he's lifting crazy weights, there's no way I could ever do this.
I think a lot of... I was listening to a podcast, and this kind of goes against what we just said, but it was with John Meadows, and he said, he's like, some guys focus on form so much, where they're using such little weight, but their form is immaculate. It's like, okay, you have great form, but, like, is the weight even high enough to achieve enough mechanical tension to even stimulate growth? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, like, that's why I think, like, some of the bro bodybuilders do use a lot of weight, because they might, I think, like, they have that maybe, like, I would say it's more of an old school thing. I know it obviously works and stuff, like, the whole mechanical tension thing, but I think they might be looking at it as a factor of driving hypertrophy in terms of mechanical tension and weight.
Yeah.
And obviously, once you get into those heavy weights, like, form starts breaking down, and I think that's why you see a lot of that. You know.
Well, and also, like, with those kind of guys, like, they have, like, drugs on their side too,
and
so
usually guide to your genetics.
Right? And they don't get injured super easily.
And I'm not saying either forget your form for adding weight on the bar, because I don't think that should ever be the case. But unfortunately, I do think that is the case for a lot of bodybuilders in the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not to say that those bodybuilders are doing everything wrong, because clearly they're not.
They're clearly not, yeah. I just think
there's probably just better ways they could go
for
about
the mass, there's definitely better ways, yeah.
Right, and maybe there's, like, better ways they could go about it from, like, an injury perspective too.
Yeah, because I feel like it's safe to say that if you're trying to drive, like, if you're trying to, if you're training for hypertrophy, like, to grow muscle, and you're just focusing on load over time, like, your chances of injury are going to be higher. You know what I mean? Like, because weight, like, if you're fucking squatting 400 pounds, that's a lot of weight for me. That's why I said that. But some of these guys, if they're squatting, like, 600-700 pounds every week, like, the chances of them, like, hurting themselves are pretty high. You know? Where if you could maybe do 500 pounds and then do just more reps and more volume and get the same growth, like, that makes more sense to me. I don't know.
I couldn't agree more. Got any water there? Anyways, guys, this has been part 2 of episode 3. We kind of dissected some questions that we don't have super definitive answers to, but if you guys, just listen to it, kind of got some food for thought, just kind of listen to our viewpoints on them. Maybe you guys have
other viewpoints,
other viewpoints or other conclusions that you could make. There's definitely going to be some guests on the channel eventually. Mike. We definitely want to have Mike on the channel, along with many other people.
Yeah, I think Nick Gloff would be good to talk about the externally and internally stabilized movements, like a squat versus a hack squat.
Yep. So, these questions are all going to be answered again by people that are smarter than us,
More
and
versed on topics.
yeah, more intelligent than us and more experienced than us, that will probably have more definitive answers of these questions. But
hope you guys enjoyed the second part of episode 3. That'll be all for today, and